Welcome. My name is Bruce Belzowski. I'm the Managing Director of the Automotive Futures Group here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I'm retired from the University of Michigan Transportation Research Institute. I want to thank the organizers for the MoBAE conference for inviting me to present today. I'll be talking about mobility as a service, some of its current and future challenges. And what we'll be talking about primarily are a few of the companies that are already working on and providing MoS services, but also some of the research that's being done, particularly here in the US, on some of the, what you might call the micro components of MoS. So I'm looking forward to talking to you about these topics. Our work in new mobility goes back about 5 years. Back in 2015, we started looking at new mobility trends and business models. In 2016, sustainable supply chains. We're looking at goods movement in that particular conference. 2017, mobility as the first entrance of mobility as a service. 2019, new mobility, automotive industry business models. Looking at what the auto industry is doing related to this. And 2020, in February, we looked at mobility as a service, the new mobility integrator. That's what we'll be talking about today. So when we look at new mobility as an integrator of services, we're looking at privately owned vehicles, car sharing, ride sharing, city and bike scooters, public transport, as well as microtransit, and more of a first mile, last mile story. There are also, of course, things connected to each one of these bubbles. In car sharing, it's Zipcar and GM Maven, which no longer exist. It's a whole nother story about talking about what the auto manufacturers are doing in this area. Ride sharing with Via Van, it's a Mercedes and Via combination. Didi in China, one of the largest ride sharing companies in the world. And in China, not only does people, but also goods movement and a variety of other things for moving goods and people. And of course, Uber and Lyft. In terms of microtransit, there's Wunder Mobility coming out of Germany. And also in terms of privately owned vehicles, there are these subscription services. And some of that has to do most likely, usually with the auto manufacturers. A lot of them have stepped back because of the pandemic from these subscription services. They always tended to be the more luxury brands to start with. When we look at what Boston Consulting Group has been doing in terms of in this area, they define 4 levels of MoS. One is the planning, where you're doing real-time optimization of itineraries with multiple transport modes. It's always a big issue and challenging issue. And then also the next step is multi-operator ticket distribution, followed by building of operators' pricing schemes into mobility packages. And again, sometimes subscription services. And also in the fully integrated model, you're actually looking at incentives to promote green modes, travel during off-peak hours and things like that. And it's a subsidy program. Very few companies are actually doing all 4 of these. When we look at some of the planning companies, we have Google Maps, City Mapper. In terms of planning and ticketing, there are some companies moving in this area. In the planning, ticketing, and pricing group, we have the WIM app, the City Mapper in London, and also in China, the Alibaba program. This is, and according to BCG, they really didn't see any fully integrated MoS offerings yet in the area of incentives. When we look at MoS, one of the main companies that's been working on this is the WIM app. Based in Finland, they also include a variety of transport programs, public transport, city bikes, taxis, affordable rental cars. They pay for all their travel through their app and have different pricing schemes. City Mapper is in London, has many of these same services, integrating of all the urban transport modes from walking and cycling and driving, probably not so much outside of London. So it becomes one of the things that holds it back on a country level basis. And then we have the Alibaba Autonavi, where you're looking at providing users can send orders from multiple platforms, calling on cars with one click. They can compare prices on multiple platforms with 5 categories of taxi that include economy, comfort, business, and luxury. And they can make their payment through Alipay, which is Alibaba's online payment system, as well as through WeChat Pay and also cards. So this is an example of what the screens look like in Autonavi, where they're looking at real-time public transportation, giving you options for walking if you would like to do that, but also you can also pick up cars and different kinds of, choose a couple different kinds of cars based on different prices. So it's really a multi-platform function, and you can call cars from different multi-platform functions. And in the US, there's a company called Cubic Transportation, relatively new company that really focuses on payment and information solutions across all the different modes of transport. When Sampo Hietanen, the CEO of WIM, talks about MoS, he asks the really big questions that are at the core of MoS. What would it take to convince you not to buy a car, but still have transportation, and to give that money to WIM for transportation service? For consumers, it's not all about cost, he talks about, and we would all be driving the cheapest car. He understands that people are driving cars because of freedom, status, and individuality. And he understands that he needs to come up with a dream as big as owning a car and capture that perceived consumer value. When I heard him tell this story, I was really impressed by his understanding of how he was going to have to make that transition for consumers. As we all know, the value is in the car, but 76% of the mobility spend is on cars that are only used 4% of the time. And he says that they need to hold that value. So it's something that he really sees as the core issue for MoS. And I think he's really on to something here. They have different packages that they're offering people from the business world, for the 15-minute packages, the cup of tea guarantee, pay as you're moved, and also family packages. So you can have a variety of choices when actually using his app. And he talks about this, and I think that he's really moving up, kind of like moving up the ladder, and here it's like climbing a mountain. You start at the low end with information on all choices, then all trips from one stop, at a one-stop shop, monthly subscription covering all your needs, roaming, mobility, a promise of anywhere, anytime to be able to move on a whim, and to combine living and mobility, meaning you're actually looking at living situations that WIM or a MoS product will provide you, and experiences on the way, so that he really sees this as a much stronger, more powerful way of talking about MoS. And he also talks about how to make money from multimodal services. You have freedom of movement, you've got sustainability, time and money saved, an end-to-end experience, the luxury end of this, as well as the individuality. So these are all areas where he sees real opportunities for MoS to grow. And when he talks about how the markets can evolve, he sees at the one end, every provider with their own ecosystem, then one provider with a winner-take-all solution, Then another one where public transportation takes it all. And finally, an open ecosystem where customers have lots of choices, where mobility as a service become the aggregators. But he also talks about it as an ecosystem, not an ecosystem, so that this is, and when you hear people talk about MoS, becomes one of the bigger challenges, to try to get all the companies on board to be able to see that they're going to make money if they go with an aggregator that can actually bring all this in one particular app that will be available to everybody and be easy to pay for, and that the participants in that ecosystem all pretty much share in the rewards of that system. And he feels pretty confident that MoS scales because their pieces already exist. This is work that he's been doing throughout the world, and he really has a nice footprint. But when you look at the footprint, you go, well, you've made some really good progress, but there's big parts of the world that are not being touched by WIM at all. So I really see this as a really open opportunity for companies in the future. The next thing I'd like to talk about is some of the research that's being done in the US on mobility. In particular, we're calling this smart mobility. Now, this is research from Argonne National Lab. This is a US government-funded research from Argonne National Labs, the Berkeley Lab, Idaho National Laboratory, NREL, and Oak Ridge. They're looking at a smart mobility consortium. It's a multi-year, multi-laboratory, collaborative, dedicated to future understanding of energy implications, opportunities of advanced mobility solutions. So they're assuming you're going to have these advanced mobility solutions, and how are they going to affect things like energy, in particular emissions, things like that. They see it as a fundamental to our way of life, with the population density increasing, more congestion, and transportation costs are high, second only to housing. And this is not only true for the US, it's also true for many other countries. But this issue of congestion and emissions is something in particular that we're seeing in China, and that what they're trying to manage. The 5 research areas that they're looking at are connected and automated vehicles, mobility decision science, understanding the human role in the mobility system. They're also looking at freight delivery, so goods movement, and also urban science, understanding the linkages between transportation networks and the built environment. And finally, advanced fueling infrastructure. In particular, they're looking at electric vehicle infrastructure in this case. We're not going to get into all this stuff, but what I wanted to show you some of the research results that they were focusing on. When they look at transportation, they see it as a system of systems, and all the things that I was just talking to you about are represented, and that they're trying to make and build into models, both modeling and simulation. Each of these individually and in combination to see their effects on the environment. So they're looking at land use, EV charging, passenger movement, goods movement, travel behavior, and control, putting that all into agent-based transportation system models, and coming out with the estimates for vehicle miles traveled, congestion, vehicle hours traveled, energy cost, and greenhouse gas emissions. So all these things are important on a large scale when you look at transport. And this is where the government feels that this is their role, to be looking at some of the big picture issues related to how this affects the country overall. So they look at different scenarios. They're looking at high sharing, partial automation, high sharing, high automation, low sharing, high automation. And sharing, they're talking about shared vehicles, ride sharing, how that might play out. The automation, of course, is the autonomous vehicle story, the connected and automated vehicle story. We're not going to get into that today, but this is one of the areas that they're looking at, and they in their research, they talk about the effects of what happens. In particular, I think they're looking at what happens when people personally own connected and automated vehicles versus those vehicles being shared. So on the left-hand side, if they are shared, energy goes down, vehicle miles traveled go down, speed actually, I think, actually increases, which could be a good thing for getting you from point A to point B. But if individuals own these vehicles and they're not shared, energy goes up, vehicle miles traveled goes up, but speed goes down because of more congestion. So they're also look at optimizing the connected and automated vehicle ride-hailing benefits, fleet benefits, so that if they actually are optimizing these types of vehicles, they get really decreased miles on zero occupancy miles. It's one of the issues that we talk about with automated vehicles. When they're driving around by themselves, they're wasting time and wasting energy instead of just waiting for and being optimized to know where they should be for their next pickup. Also, they see e-commerce as lowering the overall system VMT and energy. When individuals make individual shopping trips, instead of having deliveries, optimized deliveries, it really reduces the amount of vehicle miles traveled and energy used. But what they're also looking at traveler behavior, and some really important issues come out of this. What they find is that the value of travel time varies significantly based on the mode of transportation that you choose. Transit users, they say, and based on their research, will pay $7.60 to cut an hour of their time. Yet drivers pay $28.50 to cut an hour of their time. Of course, this all has to do with the cost of the vehicle, the initial cost of the vehicle, the insurance, the total cost of ownership that goes with owning a vehicle. But it's something that drivers have been willing to pay for quite a long time. And one of the key things that they came up with was this shift toward vehicle dependence really starts young, so that the people from the ages of 20 to 32, the number who frequently drive grows 75%, and it doesn't really level off for up until after age 50. So you can see that driving, especially in the U.S., it's a really strong pull. Even though there are these stories about the millennials not really wanting to drive again, but what they find, I think what they're finding out is, as people get a little older, or maybe they get married and they have children, and all of a sudden they need vehicles in ways that they might not have thought they needed them in the past. Another research that we were looking at is by Neda Massoud from the University of Michigan. She's looking at issues related to flexible transit, from fixed to demand responsive transit in the era of shared mobility. And here, when she's talking about flexible transit, she said it should be determined by the demand pattern and the availability of data and the availability of technology. And you can see from her chart here that she's really looking at flexible stops, fixed transit lines. And this is the kind of research that we're seeing from the professors who are really into transportation modeling. And this is what she's doing. She's doing modeling and simulation of different ways of adapting real live transit routes within different cities. So she'll take alternative routes and try to use the data that she has on some sample cities, and she puts those into her model to say what is the best way of managing this. She uses solutions framework. She has offline and online work that she does to test out how quickly computers can adjust routes to make them more efficient. She uses different shuttles. She uses shuttles as part of her kind of first mile, last mile as part of her modes of transport. And she has 2 cities that she's really been testing out in. One is Benton Harbor, Michigan, which is a relatively small city in southwestern Michigan. And she's looking at optimizing, getting people from point A to point B, waiting times being only 5 minutes, detours being only 5 minutes, based on historical demand. And she also does this with Manhattan, though, where they have 184 stations, 180 minutes, but still focusing on waiting time being only 5 minutes and any kind of detours being only at 10 minutes. So again, she's using her modeling and simulation programs to come up with better ways of designing the transport systems that already exist. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about work that Emma Lucken is doing at University of California, Berkeley. And she's talking about mobility on demand. And here we're looking at public and private partnerships. And this is, of course, one of the key issues related to MoS, right? To be able to get public and private companies working together. And what she's been doing, and she sees the mobility on demand as a little different from MoS. Mobility on demand focuses not only on passengers, but also goods and the transportation systems management, whereas mobility and service is much more focused on mobility aggregation and subscription services, but there is overlap in terms of the multimodal integration, the physicals, the fares, and the digitalness, the application, the apps that go with this. She shows, of course, the differences that once you see and understand that buses and rail offer irreplaceable space efficiencies compared to having individuals driving. And some of her, when she looks at her framework, what she has done is she's gone throughout the US and looked at 62 different private and public partnerships having to do with mobility on demand. So earlier in my talk, I talked about these examples of where there are many of these throughout, this is just the US, but there are many of these going on throughout the world where certain cities or states are really looking at individual pieces of this, trying to optimize and to really optimize their transport systems. And here she's doing interviews with public agencies and some of the mobility on demand companies. And she comes up with this a really nice map of what's going on in the US in terms of different areas and what kinds of programs they have. On the right-hand side, you see the FMLM, first mile, last mile programs, which kind of dominate a lot of these things that are going on throughout the US. And they're scattered throughout the US, but they're not everywhere in the US. So there's a lot of, this is my story about, there's really some really nice work being done on MoS related topics throughout the world, but they're just not, everything is, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to really feel comfortable. And of course, they need that integrated application to be able to make all these things work easier and better. And one of the things that I really liked about her research is that she and Professor Susan Shaheen at UC Berkeley, they're really looking at some of the challenges that they come across in these public-private partnerships, which of course are also part of the MoS story, right? There's equity, wheelchair accessibility, the gift cards, the partner with taxis, the people who don't have smartphones. How do they play into the system? Data sharing, in terms of leveraging curb space, restricted zones, regulating and obtaining data through regulation and use by third parties, both universities and think tanks to try to do some research, but also by companies who are actually wanting, private companies who want to use the data to actually optimize their programs. There's regulations and liability, drug and alcohol tests for the people who are participating, procurement in terms of negotiating with an existing partner, insurance and background checks, as well as labor management relations. To actually have to deal with union concerns for agency drivers and partner with local providers as well. All these are issues, I think, for MoS as well as for just mobility on demand, and even these much smaller groups and experiments in mobility on demand. MoS has these issues as well, and I think this is one of the major points that I want to make in terms of some of the challenges that MoS faces in the future. And in conclusion, I really see that MoS has many sophisticated integrated programs in place throughout the world. But as I said, there are many different places that are not served by MoS. So if you really looked at the evolution of where we are in the evolution of MoS, now we're past toddler stage. We may be entering teenage years, right? Where we're really looking at there are some apps out there that are very well developed and that can play a strong role in the future of MoS. But there's still lots of opportunities out there. Also, there's a lot of research by transport experts throughout the world working on optimizing whole systems, but also smaller parts of the MoS system that will be integrated as part of the MoS system. And I think that we have to understand that these things are going on and that it's not just MoS or nothing. There are lots of groups doing smaller pieces that are optimizing things for what's going on right now, but also for the future. And of course, you can't talk about anything in 2020 without talking about the pandemic. And the pandemic has slowed many of these programs and put many of the startup companies at risk of failure. The larger projects related to new mobility, they'll probably recover, but it will not be until late 2021 until we actually know which of the smaller companies and the previously unprofitable companies will survive. And here we're talking even these pretty large companies like Uber and Lyft, where they have a lot of money there's a lot of money they've put into their systems, and their ridership is down significantly. But ridership is also down in some public transport systems. And so there's a lot of issues that are related to the pandemic that are really slowing down the whole MoS process. And we'll have to see how this is going to play out. We should know by late 2021, if things are recovering well and what kinds of systems will be in place in the near future. So I want to thank everybody for listening. And again, I want to thank the MoBAE folks for inviting me to present. If you have any questions, feel free to email me at bbl@umich.edu, as it says on the screen here. I'll be glad to talk to you about any of these issues that we've been looking at. And again, thanks very much, and I hope you all have a great conference. Take care.
MoBAE, trabajando por el futuro de la movilidad avanzada y extendida.